Captain Eli Ward floated in the emptiness of space, alone in the depths of the universe. His spaceship, Odyssey, drifted silent. At first, it was faint. He thought it was just static interference, a glitch in the comm system. He was hundreds of light years away from Earth, in uncharted territory beyond the outer rim of the Milky Way, and the isolation was beginning to play tricks on his mind. Eli had trained for this. A solo mission was never easy, but he had always been a model astronaut. Calm, rational, unflappable, or so he thought. But now, they began as whispers, barely audible, a trickle of words he couldn't quite catch. He had chalked it up to the strain of extended solitude. It was understandable, right? Being alone for so long, with no human contact, not even the distant hum of Earth's atmosphere to remind him of home. "Help me," one voice said, so soft that he questioned if he had imagined it. Eli gripped the armrests of his chair. Sweat clung to the back of his neck, and his breathing became shallow, the cool air of the spacecraft not doing enough to chill his nerves. He glanced at the control panel, his eyes scanning the blinking lights. Everything was normal. The instruments were functioning as they should, the stars outside his viewport twinkling calmly, as they had for days. He exhaled slowly and reached for his headset. Maybe a chat with mission control back on Earth would help. "Command, this is Captain Ward," he said, his voice steady, despite the unease creeping at the edges. "Do you copy?" Silence. The kind of silence that only space could create, dense, absolute, all-encompassing. He tried again, this time with a more urgent tone. "Command, this is Captain Ward. Do you read me?" Nothing. Eli's mind raced. The comms should be working. He hadn't received any warnings, no technical alerts. It was as if the entire communications network had vanished, leaving him stranded in the void, completely cut off from the world. Then, the voices returned. This time, louder and clearer. "You have to wake up," one voice said, its tone strained, desperate. "The others are gone." Eli felt a chill run down his spine, his breath hitching. The sound of his heartbeat filled his ears as he looked around the cockpit, as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. He wanted to scream, to demand answers from the voice that called out to him, but his body refused to move, as if paralyzed by fear. The whispering continued, now joined by multiple voices, speaking over each other in a cacophony of dissonant tones. "Wake up," another voice urged, a sharp, cracked sound. "It's not real. What do you want from me?" Eli shouted, his voice breaking the eerie stillness of the ship. The words fell flat, swallowed by the cold, indifferent void. But then, a different voice broke through the chaos. This one was calm, measured, almost too calm. The kind of voice that made his skin prickle. "You know what you've done," it said. Eli's pulse quickened. His mind reeled. He had done nothing but follow orders, carried out his mission. A routine scan of distant star systems. An exploration of an anomaly on the outer edge of the galaxy. There was nothing more to it. He was just a scientist. Just an astronaut doing his job. But that voice, there was something in it. Something familiar. And then it hit him. It sounded like his own voice. He blinked, stunned. His breath caught in his throat. Had he been speaking this whole time? Was this all just his mind breaking down under the strain of the mission? Suddenly, the spacecraft jolted, the emergency alarms blaring in his ears, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. He jerked forward, hands instinctively gripping the controls, heart pounding. There was nothing on the instruments, no signs of malfunction or danger, but the presence of the unknown. Psalm, and Eli had no idea whether it was his sand. He needed answers. The minutes bled into hours, though Eli couldn't tell where the line between them was anymore. Time had lost its meaning. Outside the viewport, the stars remained distant, cold, and indifferent, but inside the Odyssey, everything felt different. A subtle shift, a presence. The voices hadn't stopped. They had only become more persistent, more urgent. Sometimes, they whispered his name, sometimes they begged. Other times, they were cryptic, layered in emotions he couldn't place, like distorted memories tugging at the edge of his consciousness. He tried to rationalize it, but reason was becoming harder to grasp. His mind was unraveling. He could feel it. He had trained for this. Trained for isolation. Trained for solitude. But nothing had prepared him for this. He was no longer sure if the voices were real, or if they were the product of some malfunction, a glitch in his brain or the ship's systems. But they were there. He could hear them clearly now, their tone growing sharper with each passing moment, their presence oppressive. And then, something changed. The voices stopped. For a brief moment, there was nothing. Silence so profound it nearly smothered him, leaving only the faintest hum of the ship's systems, the pulse of the life support unit in the background. But Eli didn't feel relief. No, that silence felt like a void, a space of something waiting, watching. And then he saw it. A shadow. It flickered in the corner of his eye, just outside the viewport. He turned, quick as a flash, but there was nothing there. The stars remained unchanged, distant pinpricks of light, indifferent to his growing panic. He exhaled shakily, half embarrassed by his own fear. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, that's all. Nothing out there but the cold silence of space. But the shadow came again. This time, it was closer. A wisp, a shape, an outline of something that shouldn't have been there. It darted, quick and dark, across his line of sight. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to look away, to ignore it, but his gaze was locked. For the briefest of moments, the shadow took a form. Not human, but something else. It had the outline of a figure, too tall and too thin, its edges flickering like a broken hologram. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and when he looked again, it was gone. He was losing his grip on reality. He had to be. He reached for the controls, his fingers trembling as he checked the ship's systems again. Everything was normal. Fuel levels were stable. Oxygen was intact. No signs of damage to the ship's hull. Nothing to explain the feeling of dread creeping through him like a slow, suffocating fog. Eli, a voice whispered from behind him, close, so close. He whipped around, heart racing, breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the empty cockpit, the cold steel walls of the Odyssey, and the distant hum of the engines. No, he whispered to himself, trying to steady his breathing. This is just a side effect. The isolation, the psychological strain. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't just his mind unraveling. Something else was here with him. And it wasn't content with whispering anymore. The voice spoke again, this time clear and unmistakable, echoing through the cockpit like a thunderclap, rattling his bones. You can't escape it, Eli. Eli gripped the edge of his chair, knuckles white. The voice was colder now, filled with something else, something sharp and full of malice. His chest tightened. The walls of the ship felt like they were closing in on him. He couldn't breathe. His eyes darted to the controls again. Everything was still functioning, except for one thing. The communication system. The screen flickered, displaying a crackling static image of Earth. His home, his people, the life he had left behind for this mission. But as he watched, the image shifted. The Earth began to rot, black veins snaking through the oceans, the cities crumbling into dust. He blinked, rubbed his eyes again, but it remained. The image on the screen warped, distorted like an oil painting left to rot in the sun. No, 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 he shouted, slamming his fist against the console, but the image didn't disappear. The voice, now a chorus of whispers, seemed to rise in volume, rising until it was deafening, until it swallowed everything else. You are already dead, Eli. He jerked away from the controls, the words reverberating through his skull, drilling into his mind like a hammer. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to make sense of what was happening. But how could he make sense of it? How could he explain any of this? For the first time, Eli wasn't sure if he was still in control of his mind, or if whatever was haunting him had taken over. There was a darkness in the air, pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel it. It was in the walls, in the very fabric of the ship, and he was sure of one thing. It was not just a trick of the mind. Something was out there. Something had followed him into the void of space. And it wasn't finished yet. The shadows in the corner of the cockpit seemed to writhe, flickering like the last embers of a dying fire. Eli's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the dark stretch of space outside the window. The stars, the only constant, now felt like mocking eyes. Everything in him screamed to turn away, to pretend it wasn't real. But he couldn't. He couldn't escape it. The whispers had turned into something more, something harder to ignore. They now spoke in unison, a chorus of voices that seemed to overlap, each one louder than the last. Their tone was heavy, suffocating, like they were pressing against the very air around him. "Come back, Eli," they said, every syllable a hammer against his skull. "You can't outrun this." Eli gritted his teeth, trying to focus on anything other than the growing crescendo of noise that threatened to swallow him whole. He reached for the controls, trying to pull himself together, but his hands shook, unable to grasp the cold metal with any sense of steadiness. Sweat slicked his palms. "Shut up!" he shouted, his voice breaking, the words escaping as a plea more than a command. The voices didn't stop. "You left us," one of them whispered. This voice soft and quiet, yet somehow the most painful. "You left us to die." The words hit him like a slap, and for a moment, Eli froze, disoriented. His hands trembled on the control panel, his heart hammering in his chest. What was it talking about? He hadn't left anyone behind. He had followed protocol. The mission was clear: explore the anomaly, gather data, and return. There had been no one else on the mission. It was a solo expedition. But then, the memory flashed, unbidden, jagged, slicing through his thoughts. The station. His team. Eli had been assigned to lead the Odyssey mission, a singular journey to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. But there was something he had forgotten. Something buried. Something that should have been left behind. In the chaos of launch, the final briefing had felt rushed, detached, like they were hurrying him out the door for reasons he couldn't quite understand. His last memory of the space station was a blur. Faces turned away, whispered words, the feeling of a heavy weight on his chest that he couldn't place. He had told himself it was nerves, normal for any deep space mission. But now, he wasn't so sure. The voices pressed in closer, and the words seemed to twist, coiling around him like a serpent ready to strike. "You left us," they repeated, now joined by a low, guttural growl. "You betrayed us." A cold shiver ran through Eli's body. His breath became shallow, erratic. He could barely make sense of his thoughts, the confusion closing in on him like a trap. There were no survivors on the station. He was sure of that. He had seen the reports, the wreckage, the data. Hadn't he? The comms console blinked to life, and for a fleeting moment, he thought it might be Earth, or some form of salvation. But as he gazed at the screen, his pulse quickened. The image flickered, distorting again. The screen displayed a different scene, one that he hadn't seen in years. A scene that had no place on the Odyssey. It was his team, standing in front of a large, dimly lit room, their faces pale, eyes hollow. They didn't move, their eyes fixed on him, staring through the screen as though they knew him. As if they were waiting for him. One of them, Drive, Laura Bennett, his closest colleague, stepped forward. The image was blurry, flickering, but Eli could make out her lips moving. "We're still here, Eli," she said, her voice barely a whisper, distorted and hollow. "You left us to die." Eli's chest constricted, a spike of panic piercing through his ribs. He wanted to shut it off, to turn away, but his hands were frozen to the controls, as if some invisible force had rooted him to the chair. "No," he breathed. "No, this isn't real." But the face on the screen didn't blink. It didn't move. It only stared at him with those vacant eyes, waiting, watching, and the voices around him grew louder, almost deafening. "You left us," they chanted, over and over. their voices melding into one, a single horrifying entity. He slammed his hands over his ears, but it didn't stop. The voices were inside his head now, digging into his thoughts, distorting his memories. He couldn't escape them. They were pulling him down, deeper into a pit of madness, and with each passing second, Eli felt himself losing grip on what was real. "You, a part of this," one voice hissed in his ear, so close he could feel the warmth of its breath. "You can't outrun your choices." With a sudden, violent lurch, the ship's alarm blared, cutting through the maddening cacophony. Eli's mind was spinning. Was the ship malfunctioning? Was he really losing control? Or was it just the hallucinations, the madness? His gaze snapped to the console, and his eyes widened in horror. The anomaly, the object he had been sent to investigate, was appearing on his radar. Not as a distant point, but as something much closer, looming, massive, impossibly large, a shape that defied comprehension. It wasn't just a celestial body. It was something else. A distortion, a rip in space-time, an entrance to something beyond the stars. It pulsed in the void, like a living thing, its shape shifting and flickering, as though it was beckoning him. And then, a voice, the same voice, that calm, too cold tone, came again, echoing from every direction, from within his skull. "You know what this is, Eli," it said, its words sharp, knowing. "You know what you've found." Eli's throat constricted. He wasn't sure what it was, or how it knew him, but he understood one thing. Whatever he had found, whatever was waiting for him out there, wasn't just a scientific anomaly. It was something older, something far more dangerous, and it had been waiting for him. For a long time. The ship shuddered as the anomaly's presence grew closer, its pull undeniable, like a magnetic force warping the very fabric of reality. Eli's eyes darted across the control panel, but the readings were meaningless now. Instruments flickered and fluctuated erratically, as if trying to make sense of the impossible. A tear in space? A fold in time? Eli didn't know, but the closer it came, the more disoriented he became. The voices were relentless now, filling his skull with an endless tide of words. He could no longer distinguish one from another, just a swirling, suffocating maelstrom of sound, of demands, accusations, and warnings. "Don't go there, Eli. It's too late. You can't turn back. We are waiting. We are waiting for you." A chill ran down Eli's spine, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He had to make a choice. He couldn't stay here in the gravitational grip of whatever this thing was. The Odyssey was being pulled in, and if he didn't act now, he'd be consumed, dragged into whatever was beyond that event horizon. A strange feeling settled in his gut. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It never had been. This was something personal, something ancient. The voices shifted again, twisting in ways he could no longer track. The words were no longer accusations. Now, they were warnings, as if they too were afraid of what was coming. "You've awakened it, Eli. Don't let it consume you." Eli gripped the console, staring at the anomaly on the screen. It was no longer just a shape, it was alive. It moved, it shifted, changing its form in ways that defied all understanding. A dark, pulsing mass, like an eye, a mouth, or something worse that he couldn't put into words. The longer he stared, the more it seemed to stare back at him. The more it seemed to know him. His breath hitched in his throat, panic rising in his chest. He was losing himself, losing his connection to the real world. The cockpit, the controls, even his own body began to feel unreal, as though they belonged to someone else. He felt himself drift, not just physically, but mentally. What do you want from me?" Eli whispered, the words slipping out in a hoarse, cracked voice. The answer came softly, like the whisper of a forgotten memory. "You already know, Eli. You always have." The ship was spiraling closer to the anomaly. It was pulling him in. There was no escaping it now. His mind raced, his thoughts fragmented as pieces of memories he didn't recognize began to surface. His team, the station, the mission, It all blurred together in a chaotic jumble of images. Faces of people he should have known, faces of people he had left behind, voices that should have belonged to others. But there was one memory that stood out, clearer than the rest. The briefing before his launch. Dr. Bennett's face. Her words. "You'll be the first, Eli, to touch the unknown, to uncover what lies beyond the stars. We've all been waiting for this moment." At the time, he had believed it was just the excitement of exploration, the thirst for discovery. Now, it felt like something far darker, like a sentence that had already been written in the stars. "You're a part of this now," the voice echoed once again, not from the speakers, but from somewhere deep inside him. "The universe doesn't forget, not when you've touched the edges of it." Eli's pulse thundered in his ears, the words vibrating through his body. The ship was closer now, pulling inexorably toward the center of the anomaly. He felt its power, an ancient, unrelenting force that seemed to warp his very thoughts, distorting everything he had known, everything he had believed. He could feel it now. A presence, a consciousness. It was watching him. It knew him. It had always known him. In his mind's eye, he saw the faces of his crew again, those same hollow, empty eyes. But this time, they weren't on the screen. They were here, with him. In the cockpit, they surrounded him, staring without blinking, their faces slack with grief and fear. "Eli," Dr. Bennett's voice whispered from the shadows, distant and faint, but unmistakable. "We never made it out. You left us." "No," he gasped, his chest tight. "No, this is wrong. This can't be real." But the more he resisted, the more the memory seemed to solidify around him. The air in the cockpit grew thick with it, and for the briefest of moments, he thought he could smell the sterile, metallic scent of the space station. The sharp, clean tang of metal, mixed with the sickly sweet odor of decay. He felt it all over again. The cold, the emptiness, the abandonment. His hands trembled as he reached for the comm system, but his fingers faltered. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't leave this moment. The Odyssey was no longer a ship. It was a tomb, and he was trapped inside it, surrounded by the ghosts of his own failures. The presence in the void was pulling him in now, growing larger with each passing second. The anomaly wasn't just a phenomenon, it was a doorway, a portal, an entrance into something beyond the universe, something that would consume everything in its path. And Eli? He was its chosen vessel. Suddenly, the voices stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. The absence of sound was deafening, almost unbearable. Then, the voice returned. No longer a whisper, but clear, sharp, and direct. "You're not alone, Eli," it said, its tone cold, unforgiving. "The others are with you. You are one of us now." And in that instant, Eli understood. The anomaly was not just a place. It was a prison of consciousness. It had claimed him, just as it had claimed his crew, just as it had claimed countless others who had ventured too far into the unknown. Eli wasn't just floating in space. He had crossed over. He had stepped beyond the threshold, and now, there was no going back. He was part of the void, part of something older than time itself, and whatever was waiting for him at the heart of the anomaly was not done with him yet. Eli couldn't feel his hands anymore, or his legs, or anything, really, as though his body had become a hollow shell, disconnected from the mind that still raged inside it. The voice was louder now, growing within him, a constant, gnawing presence. "You are part of it," it whispered. "You will never leave." The ship lurched again, sending Eli's head snapping back, and for a moment, everything was disoriented. The lights above him flickered, the hum of the Odyssey's engine stuttering as if the ship itself was groaning under the strain. But none of that mattered. What mattered now was the sense of something shifting, not outside the ship, but within him. He felt his consciousness being tugged, like the strings of a puppet being pulled in all directions. His thoughts splintered, fractured. The voices had become part of him now, their presence an invasive flood of memories and emotions that weren't his own. He couldn't tell where he ended and they began. There was no distinction anymore. One voice broke through the cacophony, clear and commanding, like a sharp, cold wind. "The truth is here, Eli," it said. "The truth of the Odyssey, of you." He gasped for air, but the space inside the cockpit had become thick, oppressive, like the air had weight to it. His throat tightened as though something was pushing against it from all sides. His mind flashed to the final moments aboard the station. He remembered the evacuation order. The sudden, terrifying realization that something was wrong, something had gone wrong. His team, hadn't been just crew members to him. They were family. He had known their faces, their names, their quirks, their stories. But in the chaos of the mission, they'd been reduced to nothing more than data points. A mission, a set of orders, a routine. But that moment on the station, when the anomaly first appeared, when the air had gone still, when the sensors had gone crazy, that was when everything had started to unravel. That was when they had all begun to disappear. The memory twisted in on itself. The voices, now unified, began to speak in a rhythmic chant, their tone soothing, like the sound of waves crashing on a distant shore. "We are part of you. We have always been. You cannot escape the past." Eli gripped the edge of his seat, his mind still reeling, the events of his mission becoming something other, something beyond what he could comprehend. He had thought he was on a scientific mission. But now, he understood. He wasn't exploring the unknown. He had crossed a threshold, a line that no human should have ever crossed. And the truth was worse than he could have imagined. Suddenly, the lights above him dimmed, plunging the cockpit into darkness. A heavy silence pressed down on him, suffocating. Eli gasped, the sound of his breathing deafening in the stillness. Then, from the blackness, the images began to appear. The faces of his crew. Not in the sterile, calm images he remembered, but distorted, twisted by the shadows of the anomaly. Their eyes were wide and empty, hollow sockets where their pupils should have been, their skin pale and stretched tight against their bones. They reached toward him, their hands outstretched, their mouths moving soundlessly. Eli recoiled, but his body felt too heavy to move. "Come with us," their voices whispered in unison, their words like a distant, dreamlike echo. "We have always been waiting, Eli." The darkness deepened, and the faces of his crew began to flicker, like bad video footage. The shadows around him seemed to crawl across the walls of the cockpit, twisting and undulating as though alive, feeding off his fear. Eli squeezed his eyes shut, but when he opened them again, they were still there, still waiting. The cockpit lights flickered again, bright then dark, and when they returned, everything had changed. He was no longer in the Odyssey. He was standing in the middle of the station, the same one he had left behind. But it was different now. The sterile white walls were cracked, rusted, and covered in black tendrils that seemed to pulse, growing in unnatural patterns, as if the station itself was alive. The air felt thick with something, a weight that pressed down on his chest. The hum of the station's life support systems was gone, replaced by an eerie, muffled silence that stretched deep into the empty corridors. Then came the sound, scraping, dragging, echoing from somewhere down the hall. Eli's heart thudded in his chest, but he couldn't move. He felt as though the gravity of the station had increased, as though every step, every breath, was more difficult than the last. The crew members, his team, were there. But they weren't themselves. Their faces were still distorted, twisted in ways that made Eli's stomach churn. But now, they were moving, walking in the corridors, aimlessly dragging their feet as if bound to the same force that had a hold of him. The whispers returned, not from the voices in his head, but from the shadows themselves. "You didn't listen," they murmured. "None of you listened." Eli's breath came in shallow gasps. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The weight, the suffocating presence of the anomaly, had followed him into the very heart of his memories. One by one, the faces of his crew turned toward him, eyes wide, mouths stretched into silent screams. "You are not alone, Eli," they said. "We are here. We are with you." A final, chilling voice, the voice that had spoken to him from the beginning, The calm, measured one, spoke from behind him. You knew this would happen. You chose this. Eli turned, his blood running cold. The figure standing before him was not just one of his crew. It was himself, but older, hollow-eyed, the skin stretched tight over bone. His hands were shaking, and his mouth opened to speak, but only a low, guttural hiss emerged. You did this, it said. You called us here. You brought us to this place. The walls began to close in, the station warping around him, the very air bending with the pressure of the distortion. Eli wanted to scream, but no sound came from his lips. He was trapped. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was his reality now. The anomaly had claimed him, and it wasn't done yet. He had crossed the threshold. He had awakened it, and now, there was no turning back. Eli could feel his pulse in his throat, steady but frantic, as the station around him seemed to pulse with an eerie life of its own. The walls throbbed, a sickly rhythm in time with his heart. The air felt heavier now, pressing against his chest as if the weight of the anomaly itself had folded in around him. He couldn't escape it, couldn't outrun the sense that everything, the ship, the station, even his mind, was crumbling, fading, falling into a space that didn't belong to reality anymore. The figure that stood before him, his own twisted reflection, opened its mouth again, its voice a rasping whisper. You thought you could leave it all behind, didn't you, Eli? The words were like needles, piercing the fabric of his sanity, unraveling everything he thought he knew. His breath hitched, his hands trembling as he reached out, as if trying to grasp the remnants of his identity, something to hold on to. But the shadows were closing in, warping the space around him, as if the very environment was reflecting his fractured mind. I didn't mean for this to happen. Eli's voice was barely a whisper, raw, full of fear, yet it felt hollow, distant. It felt like it wasn't even his. The reflection of himself in front of him smiled, or rather, grinned. A jagged, painful smile that twisted the air itself. It wasn't comforting. It was a mockery. You never meant it, Eli. But you've been a part of this all along. From the beginning. Eli closed his eyes, trying to shut it out, to block it out, but the voices came again, louder now, more insistent. We've always been here. You've always known. The weight of the words crushed him. He couldn't escape the undeniable truth that was crawling under his skin. There was something in his past that had brought him here. Something he had forgotten, buried deep within himself, a memory that he wasn't ready to face. But the more he tried to resist, the more it pulled him in, like the gravity of the anomaly itself. And the faces of his crew, his family, emerged from the shadows once more, their eyes wide and accusatory. You didn't listen. You abandoned us, Eli. You let us die. The words echoed through the empty halls of the station, repeating in waves, over and over again. His legs buckled beneath him, and he sank to the cold, metallic floor, his mind reeling with the impossibility of it all. But deep down, a fragment of understanding began to form. The pieces of the puzzle that had evaded him were finally falling into place. The voices, the distorted memories, the twisted reflections, everything was leading him to one conclusion. The station had never been destroyed. The station had changed. His team, his crew, hadn't died. They had transformed. He saw it now. He remembered the last moments before he had left. The flickering lights in the corridors. The unnatural calm that had fallen over the station as it had started to hum with an energy he couldn't place. The message that had been sent from the anomaly. The message that had been intercepted by his mission control. And the warning that had been dismissed as just interference. They had all been warned. But Eli hadn't listened. And now, the consequences of that decision were becoming undeniable. The voice, the cold, omnipresent voice, spoke again, but this time it was clearer. More direct. We are not what you think. You brought us here. Eli's eyes shot open. He wasn't in the station anymore. He wasn't in the cockpit of the Odyssey. He was standing in the heart of the anomaly. The space around him bending and stretching in ways that didn't make sense, twisting his perception of what was real. His body felt like it was being stretched, torn apart, and yet, there was no pain. Only the cold, suffocating weight of inevitability. And then, the truth was revealed. The stars, the distant galaxies, the space that had once felt infinite and vast. They were fading away. The fabric of reality itself was bending, breaking apart. Everything was shifting. The anomaly was more than just a place, it was a condition. A rip in space-time, yes, but it was also a bridge, a conduit to something else. Something ancient, something that predated the universe itself. The faces of his crew flickered once more, but this time, they weren't distorted. They were clear, and they weren't alone. Behind them, something stood. Something dark and formless, looming in the distance. A shape, massive, ancient. It was as though the anomaly had peeled back the layers of time and space, revealing something that had been waiting at the edges of reality for eons. And it was watching him. "You thought you could escape," the voice murmured, its tone heavy with the weight of ages. "But you are part of it now. You always have been." The faces of his crew stared at him. Dr. Bennett's eyes, wide, filled with sorrow and understanding, locked onto his. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Only the sound of her breathing, soft and steady. Eli's heart ached. What had he done? "You brought us here," she whispered. "You opened the door." The edges of his vision blurred. He could feel himself falling, not physically, but mentally. The weight of his own guilt, the crushing realization of what he had unleashed, was too much to bear. But then, as if answering the weight of his despair, the anomaly shifted, bending reality once more. The space around him began to shimmer, rippling like a mirage. The reflection of his crew vanished, replaced by something else. An image, crystal clear, of his past. He saw himself, standing at the edge of the station, looking out at the anomaly. He saw his younger self, his naive hope, as he made the decision to continue forward. To ignore the warnings, to keep pushing, to keep exploring, to keep seeking the truth. And in that moment, he understood. The anomaly was not just an external force. It was a mirror. It had been waiting for him to make that choice. It had known that he would come. It wasn't just the crew that had changed. It was him. The truth settled in his chest, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't just part of the mission. He was part of the anomaly. And the worst part? He had always been. Eli had been chosen the moment he had decided to seek answers. And now, there was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone. The void had claimed him. And the universe was watching. Eli's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood, frozen, on the edge of the infinite void. The anomaly loomed before him, now no longer just an object of fascination or terror, but a living, pulsing thing, its presence an undeniable force in his mind. It was not just a tear in space-time anymore, it was the source. The beginning, the end, the universe itself had been folded around him, and he had crossed its threshold. He had become part of its fabric, twisted into a pattern that he couldn't fully comprehend. Every thought, every memory, every feeling felt like it belonged to someone else. He no longer knew where he ended and the anomaly began. He was inside it now, inside the space between worlds, and it had claimed him. The faces of his crew, now perfectly clear, continued to stare at him, unblinking, unyielding. They were no longer the broken, twisted versions from earlier. Now they were calm, serene. Dr. Bennett's eyes, filled with sorrow, softened as she stepped toward him. Her mouth moved, but no sound emerged. A strange calm washed over him as he understood. This wasn't a vision, a hallucination, or a dream. This was real, and he was here. The anomaly wasn't just drawing him in anymore. It was opening him up, unveiling the truth. The weight of it pressed down on him like the slow, steady pull of a black hole. "You've crossed over, Eli. You've awakened us," Dr. Bennett's voice whispered, not through her lips, but through his mind. Her voice was softer now, but laced with a kind of finality that shook him to his core. "You were never meant to leave. None of us were." His body trembled. the truth settling like a rock in his chest. This had never been about a mission, about exploration, about discovery. It had been about this, about crossing the boundary between the known and the unknown. The anomaly had been waiting for someone who would willingly open the door. And he had opened it, just as they had all been waiting for him to do. The faces of his crew began to shift. No longer their faces alone, but faces, other faces, ancient faces, emerged from the blackness of the void. They were unfamiliar, yet familiar. They had the same haunted, hollow-eyed expression as his crew, but they were older, from an age long before humanity. Long before time itself had meaning. "We are the lost," the voice echoed, no longer just Dr. Bennett's, but 1,000 voices, speaking as one. "We are those who crossed the threshold, those who sought the edges of the universe, and found it was not what they expected." A flood of memories, strange, alien memories, began to pour into Eli's mind. He saw them. Beings who had long since crossed the boundary of reality, who had gazed into the eyes of the unknown and had become part of it. He saw their faces, distorted, like the one before him. He saw their eyes, filled with the same sorrow, the same acceptance. "We are those who tried to break the pattern," the voice continued. "But the universe does not bend. It consumes. It absorbs. It becomes." Eli wanted to scream, but no sound escaped him. The words echoed inside his skull, reverberating like a warning, a truth too terrible to face. He had seen his own reflection in the anomaly, and now it was clear. He wasn't just here because he had opened the door to the unknown. He was meant to be here. He had always been meant to be here. He was one of them. The truth of his mission became clear. The Odyssey hadn't been sent to explore. It had been sent to feed, to bring back the one who would open the gate, to bring back the one who would cross into the void and become part of it. The Odyssey hadn't failed its mission. It had succeeded. Eli's legs buckled beneath him as the weight of everything crushed down on him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The void stretched out around him, consuming everything he had ever known. It was no longer just the anomaly. It was everything. "Eli," the voice said, but this time it was no longer the voice of Dr. Bennett or his crew. It was something more, something older. "We've been waiting for you." And then, everything went silent. The faces of his crew were gone. The ancient beings who had crossed into the void were no longer there. The endless stretch of space in front of him had become a seamless black, an endless ocean of nothingness. The station, the Odyssey, the stars, they were gone. Everything had dissolved, folded into the center of the anomaly, absorbed into its being. Eli was no longer floating, no longer trapped. He was part of it now. The reality he had known, his old self, his old life, was gone. He had crossed the final horizon. In the infinite dark, a single thought flickered through his mind. There is no escape. And then, there was nothing. Eli's mind drifted, and the sensation of existing, and not existing, began to blur. Time, once a steady progression, had stopped its forward march. He had crossed into a space beyond the constraints of time, a place where neither the past nor future held meaning. The last vestiges of his humanity, the memories of his crew, of his mission, of the person he once was, were slipping away like sand through his fingers. But still, the presence of the anomaly lingered, wrapped around his very being. It had become his reality now, the truth that had been revealed to him, a truth too terrible to truly comprehend, settled in his bones like cold, ancient stone. "You are part of it now. You always have been." He wanted to scream, to lash out, to resist, but there was no one to hear him. There was no one to fight. The void, once so vast and unknowable, now felt like a confining cage, a cocoon of silence that he could neither escape nor break. It wasn't space anymore. It wasn't a place. It was a state of being, an existence outside the fabric of time, where every moment was a fragment of something larger, something older. The universe had folded upon itself, and Eli was now its part, an integral piece of the unsolvable puzzle. There was no way back. There never had been. The voices of his crew, their pleading, their accusations, had faded. Now there was only the hum of the anomaly, a low, resonant vibration that was somehow in his mind and all around him at once. The unity of the voices had gone silent, but their presence remained. He could still feel them, not in his ears, but deep inside his chest, vibrating through the core of his very being. He was aware of everything. He was aware of nothing. But then, something new emerged from the void. A new voice, distinct from the others. It was quiet at first, like a whisper from the edge of a dream. It didn't come from within him, nor was it outside him. It was part of the space itself, woven into the very fabric of the anomaly. "I warned you," it said softly. The voice was male, familiar, but distant. A voice Eli hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. It was his own voice. A younger version of himself, one he had long forgotten, one buried under the layers of the past. A version of himself before the mission, before the Odyssey, before the crew, before the anomaly. It was the voice of the Eli who had once stood on Earth, hopeful and determined, eager to make history. The Eli who had dreamed of exploring the unknown, who had dreamed of pushing the boundaries of human understanding. But now, in this place, that version of himself felt like a distant memory. "A stranger. You never understood," his younger self continued, the words now filling the silence with a chilling clarity. "You thought you could solve it. You thought you could control it. But the truth is, you never had a choice. Not really. This has always been the plan." Eli closed his eyes. Or perhaps he didn't. It was hard to tell anymore. It didn't matter. The truth of it was inescapable. The decision had been made long before he had ever boarded the Odyssey. The anomaly had been waiting for someone, for him, to come and open the door. It had whispered to him in his dreams, in his quiet moments of doubt, urging him forward. And when the time came, when the Odyssey had drifted too close, when the anomaly had reached out from the edges of space, it had drawn him in. And now he understood. There had been no mission, no crew, no exploration, only the inevitable. The faces of his crew, those that had become so familiar and twisted in his mind, were not just projections or hallucinations. They were echoes of those who had crossed over before him, echoes of others who had opened the door, who had walked too far into the unknown. They, too, had been swallowed by the void, absorbed into its endless fold, becoming part of something greater. And now, he too was one of them. The voices were not just memories. They were connections. The minds of those who had been lost. The souls who had crossed the boundary. The anomaly had taken them, and it had taken him, too. In the stillness, he began to hear a new whisper, like a thread weaving through the fabric of the void. It was faint, but growing stronger. A presence, a shape, something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. It wasn't a voice this time. It was something else. Something old, something vast. "You have become us." Eli shuddered, though he couldn't remember if his body was still capable of that sensation. He couldn't tell if he was still himself, if he was still human. The lines between who he was and who he had become had been erased. He had no name, no identity anymore. He was part of the anomaly, part of this living void that stretched infinitely, beyond space and time. And in that final moment, the revelation came to him. The truth he had sought, the truth he had avoided, was now clear. The anomaly wasn't something that existed outside of the universe. It was the universe itself. The boundaries between dimensions, between realities, were not just things to be discovered. They were forces, the strings that held the cosmos together. The anomaly was not a tier. It was the space between worlds, the birthplace of everything and the end of everything. It was nothing and everything. And now, Eli was part of it. He had crossed the final horizon, a boundary beyond which no one could return. And there, in the infinite silence of the void, he realized that the universe was not a place to be explored. It was a cage to be crossed. And once you crossed it, once you became part of it, there was no going back. Eli had opened the door. But now, he was the door. He was the doorway. And the universe, with all its infinite expanse, had claimed him, body, mind, and soul. The final truth settled like a weight in the vast emptiness. He was no longer just Eli. He was now part of everything. And there was no escape.